when you're staying on the Azure platform, using a managed identity is the safer option. We already did that a few times, so we know how this works. 1. You enable the managed identity at level of the thing that needs to access something. That is at level of the logic app. And if we look here at the identity blade, we see that we already did that. We did that in one of the previous demos actually. 2. We need to give this identity the necessary permissions to access the thing you want to access. And that happens at level of the thing you want to access. So giving those permissions happens in this case at level of the function. And 3, then we need to use the managed identity for authentication. Essentially, that means that the thing that needs access will use the managed identity to get a token. That token will be passed to the thing that requires that token. It will be validated there and it will allow access or not. So step 1 is done. Step 3 is easy, as you will see, but step 2 is a little bit more complicated. Remember that when we needed to allow our function to access blob storage, it was a matter of assigning a role to the managed identity. We made it a storage blob data owner, and that was it. It's not that easy for a function. When you use a managed identity, managed means managed by Entra ID, Microsoft's built-in IAM solution on Azure. It's supported by as good as all Azure services. When configuring that for a function, which often consists of a set of API endpoints, we need to be a bit more explicit, let's say. First of all, let's note down the object principal here, so the principal ID of the managed identity of the logic app. We're going to need it because it's this service principal that will need to give access. The second thing that we're going to need is the tenant ID. You remember that from way in the beginning of the Getting Started course. We can find that over on Entra ID. Here it is. And we want to note that one down as well. That's because it's this tenant that we will use to enable authentication support. The third thing we need is the application identifier of the enterprise application associated with our managed identity. This may require a bit of additional explanation. When we enabled managed identity at level of the logic app, a related enterprise application was registered in Entra ID. You can find those via the enterprise applications blade here. This enterprise application registration has the same name as the logic app and the same object ID as our managed identity's service principal. Simply put, you can look at that enterprise application as the description of your app, the logic app in this case, to let Entra ID know a bit more about how it should work in your local tenant. Things like consent and permissions, that's what I'm talking about here. So let's search for the enterprise application registration by pasting in the service principal we noted down. And here it is. As you can see, it has the exact same name as our logic app, but it definitely is an enterprise application. Let's note down the application ID because we're going to need this one as well. Alright, and with that we have the 3 IDs we need. Now you may wonder, why am I not using the service connector approach here? After all, I did that a few times in previous demos to set up authentication using a managed identity between Azure services. Well, it doesn't exist for logic apps at the moment of speaking. Moreover, I also think it's interesting to do this manually once. It gives you a better feeling of what exactly is going on. So, onto the function app, because that is where we need to define that the managed identity is allowed to access it. I've got that open here still. Here we now need to go to the authentication blade. And we need to enable Entra ID authentication. We do that by clicking Add an identity provider. The identity provider we want to select is Microsoft. That's the Entra ID identity provider. So then we need to register an application in Entra ID that will be used to access this function with. We actually have that, right? That's our logic app registration, because it's the logic app that needs to access the function app. So I simply choose to provide the details of an existing app registration. I paste in the client ID, that's the value we just noted down, the last one from Entra ID. And then I can potentially pass through a client secret as well. But if you remember, secrets are not needed when using a managed identity because they are managed behind the scenes by Entra ID. So we can just leave this empty. The issuer URL we need to pass through is a fixed value. It starts with https sts.windows.net followed by my tenant ID. And the tenant ID, we know that one because we noted that down as well. That was the one we could find over at the overview blade of Entra ID. So let me paste that in here. And then we need to pass through the allowed token audience. I'm going to input a fixed value here, management.azure.com. This is a built-in value for an audience that will allow access to various Azure services, like the function. So any request that comes into this function app without this value as an audience value will be rejected. Then we can input a few additional security checks. We can choose to only allow specific client applications to access this function app. So what I can do now is input the ID of our Logic app registration in Entra ID. That will mean that only requests for tokens created by this one will be allowed access. I can also choose to only allow requests from specific identities. In this case, if I input the principal ID of my managed identity, it's only through this managed identity that tokens will be able to be requested that will allow access to this function app. I'm going to do that. And also, I'm only going to allow tenants from my Entra ID tenant. Whether or not you want to do this kind of depends. The stricter you are here, the more difficult it will become to access this function. And that may be exactly what you want. If you're completely sure that you only want one specific type of action to your function app, so from our Logic app using the managed identity with tokens created by Entra ID, that's how we set it up. If that's the only thing you want, then this is a good thing to do. However, this also means that this is the only way to gain access to the function app. Imagine, for example, that you have another application, an app service, for example, that needs to integrate with this function, or another Logic app that needs to integrate with this function. Or maybe you even have an application that isn't even hosted on Azure, but that needs to be able to call this function endpoint, maybe even with a token that isn't generated by Entra ID. All of that is possible, but then of course you can't be as strict here as we are now, because the way we set this up now will disallow all those other types of access. So what you want to do here is again pretty dependent on your use case. Know that I'm being pretty strict here for the demo and that you don't necessarily need to do that if you have a good reason and a good use case to access this function in another way. Obviously, we want to restrict access. We're going to require authentication. And seeing we are dealing with an API, we want to return a 401 unauthorized when an invalid token or an invalid means of authentication is passed through. Let's click Add. And there we go. To check if this works, let me try and navigate to one of our function endpoints. I'm going to do that using the function key. So let's open get itineraries here. Try and get a function URL. Let's take the one with the function key and let me paste that here. And I don't have permissions to view this page anymore. Let's see what happens if I try and run it like this. So I'm going to get it using the function key. Let me run this. And we indeed see that what we got back was a 401 unauthorized. So there we go. By requiring this token, we have now disabled function keys and other API keys. So this too is something to keep in mind. You cannot combine token authentication with API key authentication. In our case, we've been even more strict. We require a token with a specific audience value generated by Entra ID, by a specific client, and by a specific app registration. The only thing that will allow access are the tokens created by our managed identity. If you want to be less strict, as explained, that is possible as well. Anyway, we do need to change something now. Let's have a look at our code base. Our code base still requires a function key here to be passed through, as we set the authorization level to function. When you're using tokens, you don't require API keys anymore, so the authorization level, which looks at the API key, should be set to anonymous. We are no longer using API keys for authentication, we're using tokens, so authorization level is anonymous. And I'm going to do that for all of these functions. Let's save this and let's publish this. Our function app has been published. So the last part of the story is ensuring that we use the managed identity at level of our logic app, so at level of that workflow, when we access the function. Let's navigate to the logic app again. Let's first try running it again as is. We are not using the managed identity at this moment. We are using the function key, as you remember. So I'm just going to resubmit the last successful logic app run. It was successfully resubmitted. Let's refresh this here. It has failed, which makes sense. As you can see, in the HTTP step, we get back an unauthorized. So this is what we expect. Now we need to use the managed identity here. So I'm going to open the Logic App Designer again, going to open the HTTP action. I'm also going to get rid of this function key here. And to enable authentication with the managed identity, I choose authentication here. I choose managed identity. I choose the system assigned managed identity. That's the one we have used. And I also need to enter the audience. And we remember what the audience is. https://management.azure.com. This will result in the managed identity requesting a token with this as audience, and this is then checked at level of the function. All right, let's save this. And let's resubmit the last run, the one that failed. All right, Logic App was successfully resubmitted. Let's refresh. And as you can see, we have access again, this time using the managed identity. But we kind of run into another issue now during development. Let's have a look at that next.